Hey everybody, this is Dr. Karen, and I am so excited to share this interview that I have done with my colleague, Dr. Meredith Harold. For those of you who don't know Dr. Meredith, she is an assistant professor at Rockhurst University in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders in Kansas. And she is also the owner of a website called The Informed SLP, where she shares applied research for people who are practicing in the field of speech pathology and audiology. In this interview, we talk about how Dr. Meredith took a non-traditional path after her doctorate and why she has absolutely no regrets about doing that, and how having a doctorate gave her additional leverage in those endeavors. We also talk about how she actually almost ended up doing 2 dissertations because she got 9 months into one, was all ready to write up her final chapters, and just realized that she had to completely start over. And she talks about how she was able to pick up and keep going after that setback. She also talks about what drives her crazy about what university faculty sometimes do to graduate students and what students can do to stand out in their degree programs. And finally, she talks about why getting her doctorate was one of the best decisions she ever made. So with that, I will leave you to enjoy this interview with Dr. Meredith Harold. All right, so you have taken a different route than a lot of people with doctorates in your field. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've gotten where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So I entered a PhD program in speech language pathology right out of my undergrad. So I started my undergrad in '01 and graduated with my PhD in 2011. So a decade in school.
Wow.
Yeah. After that, the traditional route for my field would have been for me to take a postdoctoral position and then after a couple years apply for a faculty position. But I didn't. I decided instead to go work as a clinician for a couple years, and then ended up staying in clinical work for a solid 5 years. I worked in schools, I had a private practice. And then after that, I re-entered academia at a teaching institution and opened up a business that I have now today called the Informed SLP, which is basically a membership website that connects clinicians in my field with research. So in some ways, I have a vein of a traditional academic path because I am a professor right now, but honestly, I tend to identify a lot more with the alt-ac track because of the businesses I've had and because my mind is kind of always one foot inside academia and one foot not.
So why didn't you do the traditional route? What made you go a little bit off the beaten track?
Yeah, that could turn into a long story. I'll try to make it kind of short story. But basically, I couldn't stand the idea of doing a postdoc. To be perfectly honest, I just literally could not stand the idea of doing a postdoc. And there's a couple reasons why. One is I met my husband a couple years before I graduated with my PhD. And unfortunately, exactly at the time when I was finishing my PhD, his career was on this massive uphill slope. And for me to take a postdoc would have meant leaving our city. It would have meant him quitting his job. And financially, it just would have been stupid, to be perfectly honest. Like, we just weren't in a position at that point in time where it made any sense for like a family unit to do that. So that was one factor, that financially and personally, it was just horrific timing to like up and go take a postdoc. And then there was a lot of other things going on in my mind too. Like, I had been in school for 10 years, and the idea of going and getting paid $40,000 to get 2 more years of training just sounded awful to me. Like, I just hated it, and I still hate it today. Like today, to me, the idea of doing a postdoc is just like, ugh. Because as a clinician, I could make double that, you know? So there I was like, okay, do I stay in academia and get 2 more years of training after I feel like I've just had a decade of training? Like, when can I have a real job, or do I go get a real job and make twice as much money? So that was part of it too, is just the idea that I just did not like the idea of doing a postdoc at all. And then kind of the third factor is, I had a lot of freedom when I was in my doctoral program. I had an advisor who gave me a ton of creative freedom and really just kind of let me run wild in a certain extent in the lab, in terms of I could come up with, experiments and ideas, and he would let me pursue those things. And I sort of had this feeling of like closing in on me as I got toward the end of my PhD program, where I felt like as soon as I took a postdoc and then took a faculty position, that freedom would kind of be gone. And so that was another factor for me too. So it was like this complex, like, time for me where, for money reasons, personal reasons, and then just doubting kind of the academic path, I decided to just step out of it. And when I took my first clinical job with a PhD, I didn't necessarily plan on exiting academia forever. I planned on just doing that for a little bit in order to gather my thoughts in my head, but I ended up staying out of academia for 5 years before I came back.
So you've really gotten creative with how you've used that PhD then. Do you think it gave you more leverage, even though you didn't go the traditional route?
Way more leverage. And I would say, one thing that I think that most PhDs do not realize, especially if they've never had a foot in the business world at all, is how incredibly valuable the degree is. So even if I had never gone back to get a faculty position, there's so many ways that I've been able to, exactly like what you said, leverage my PhD to my advantage when it comes to my career. So when I opened a private practice as a clinician, there was a big difference between me doing that with a PhD and me doing it if I had a master's degree, which is what most speech language pathologists had. It immediately catapulted me to another level with that business. And then same thing with my current website that I operate. The fact that I have a PhD alone just puts everything at a higher level when it comes to the way I can market my skill set, that it's incredibly valuable. Don't you think most PhDs don't realize what they're sitting on sometimes when it comes to not understanding where their degree can actually take them outside of academia?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when people say things, you read all these articles, if you Google PhD, and there's all this stuff about, a PhD is just a waste of money and time, and it's not worth what it used to be. So you're saying that that's a bunch of BS, basically.
I personally think it's a bunch of BS. I think that I think that it's not like when you get a PhD, you go out into the world and you're like, somebody value me, like somebody, take me seriously, hire, like yes, it naturally helps you get jobs, but to a certain extent, you have to understand how to market your PhD. You have to understand how it can be used. And that's something that most students aren't trained in their doctoral program. Most students within their PhD program are only taught how to be a professor, and they don't understand necessarily that there's a lot of ways that you can use your PhD that are in business and industry that have nothing to do with being an academic faculty whatsoever. But you have to kind of find that path on your own, because your academic advisor doesn't know how to do that because he or she didn't do that, So
it's leverage, not a magic bullet, not
Yep.
a magic, everybody's going to think I'm big and important because I'm a doctor, but it is an opportunity to leverage that experience to gain all those skill sets that can make you way more marketable.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
So when I'm going to skip around a little bit. So since we had talked about a little that how you didn't necessarily go the traditional route, but even with that in mind, you were still able to leverage that degree. So what would you say to people who are at the tail end, maybe they're ABD, maybe they're struggling and really stressed out, and they're thinking, is this even worth this to finish my graduate degree, whether it be a master's or a PhD? What would you say to somebody who's in that situation right now?
The biggest mistake is to start it and not finish it. It's okay to not want to do it in the first place. It's okay to, in the first place, not enter a master's program, and in the first place, not enter a PhD program. But the biggest waste of opportunity and money is to start it and not finish it. So I didn't pull any research studies for us at all today, so I'm not going to be able to correctly cite things here. But there's been tons of studies that show that it's so much more, like, basically, if you leave a program, whether or not it's an undergrad program, a master's program, or a PhD program, with just a little bit of time left, you may as well have not have done that program at all, when it comes to the impact on your career. That the true impact really comes from finishing, not from starting it or doing half of it. It's just one of those things, you just got to finish it. It can be excruciating at times, and it's hard, and it's not easy, but it's so worthwhile to just finish it once you've already started it. I was in a big lab as a doctoral student, and when I started, there was probably 10 to 12 PhD students with me who, over the course of my career in that PhD lab, started, and a little under half of us finished. So of all the people who I knew who had started their PhD during that time, a little under half of us finished. And there's a big difference between those of us who finished and what we've been able to, get out of our careers, and those who don't finish. It's valuable to finish.
Do you still keep in touch with some of those people? The people who finished and didn't?
All of them. Yep. Wow. All of them I talk to at least sometimes. Mm-hmm.
And so what's the difference in, obviously there's got to be a difference in salary.
Yeah, there is.
What about just life satisfaction and just happiness in their career?
That's a good question, because, some of the people that didn't finish, sometimes some of them, there's some things that they have in common, and there's maybe other things that they don't. Everybody has their own individual circumstances that sometimes lead them to not being able to finish something. I almost would say the thing instead that those of us who finished have in common is that all of us were really go-getters. All of us, once we decided we wanted something, were almost ravenous in making sure we got it, in terms of being highly driven and kind of having like a competitive streak in us, where once we started something, we just were going to see it through to the end, no matter how awful, boring, or stressful or excruciating it was. And it didn't mean that it was easy. Out of all of us that finished, I can look at all of us and say all of us had, breakdowns at certain times where, like, the anxiety and the stress just completely overtook us, but it never stopped us from, like, putting one foot in front of the other and just getting it done. Are we like happier in terms of life satisfaction? That's really hard to judge. And I would hate to even, say, who I think is happier than one person or another. But I will say that we definitely have a lot more career opportunities by far. And if that's something that's important to somebody, then it might contribute to their happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned that the people who finished, they had the mental breakdowns too. They had stress. That it was difficult for them.
Yeah.
How about the people who didn't finish? Did they also encounter that?
Yep. All of it.
Why they didn't finish?
Yeah. And the people who didn't finish all had, the breakdowns and the stress and everything, but it's almost as though once that would happen, they would exit, as opposed to just like staying in it. So
it was less about the fact that, it's not that you were any luckier and you didn't have that happen to you or whatever it was, but it's just more of how you responded to that situation and the stress.
Yeah, I think definitely.
What when you were in the trenches and when you had one of those breakdowns or whatever, what was it that kept you going? Like, how were you able to get out of that?
I think that this could vary from person to person. And I don't know how universal my response will be, but for me, I just loved being a PhD student. Like, I loved learning and I loved the science. And, to a certain extent, some of the like meat of doing the work of that, doing the classes and doing the studying and doing all the writing and doing the experiments and doing the failed experiments, like, it was hard a lot of times, but I kind of didn't care because I knew all along the way that I just loved the learning and the science, and that's kind of what kept me going. And I also just couldn't see quitting once I had come so far. Like, it was very clear to me that no matter what, I had to finish that process. Like, I had started my PhD, I was partway through, I was 3/4 of the way through. Like, there was no question in my mind that it would have been silly to stop, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So it was almost like the idea of quitting was just not an option to you. Like,
Yeah, it pretty much just was not an option. Yeah, and it's not to say that I don't quit things, because like I actually would consider myself to be comfortable with quitting things, but strategically. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay to choose to not do something and to pivot. And in fact, that's what smart people do, is look at their circumstances and figure out, okay, is this going to work for me? Is this working for me? Is this going to get me what I want? And if not, then to pivot. I mean, that's what I've done in my career multiple times, is to examine where I am and then try something different, But when it came to finishing my PhD, that wasn't oh, maybe I should try something else thing to me. That was okay, I have to finish this step. And once I get through that step, then if I want to pivot and try a different path, I could,
Yeah. So it's not about just being pigheaded and going forward with something that doesn't make sense, but it's really about having a clear purpose. And really
I knew that it was
why you're doing it.
Mm-hmm. I knew that it was smart to finish it, period. It just was smart to finish it, like, full stop, So I did.
Yeah. Now that you are on the other side and you're working with graduate students, do you notice that there are certain qualities and behaviors in the students who are doing well in their degree programs versus the ones who are struggling?
Yeah. So one thing that I see, kind of a common thread in graduate students who tend to do really well, is those students who kind of like own both their successes and their failures. The students who, when they do something right, they get excited about it and they feel proud. And when something doesn't go well, whether or not it's a failed experiment or, like a paper that they've written and their advisor's like, this is a big load of crap, you're going to have to start over from the beginning, whatever the failure may be, they take it as a learning experience and feel grateful for the fact that they just went through that, as opposed to feeling completely defeated by it. It's not that the failures don't hurt, and it's not that the failures aren't stressful, but I think the students who can see the failures as basically like learning experiences and kind of be grateful for what they are the ones who tend to just keep on chugging forward and do fine.
Mm-hmm.
It always surprises me, the graduate students that get that can't handle any degree of failure or criticism. That get almost like offended when everything doesn't go perfectly.
Yeah. Do you think it's that they are perhaps they're smart, they're used to being successful, and that this is the first time that they've experienced that criticism, that maybe things have been easy up until this point?
A lot of times. Yeah. I've definitely seen graduate students that fit that profile for sure.
Because we're talking about, if I think it's we looked it up the other day, my husband and I, and it's
Mhm.
less than 2% of the US has a doctorate, and less than 9%, or it's 9% has a master's degree. So we're to be even in the program, you're
Right.
more educated than
Right.
most people. So
Right.
you're probably not used to failure, or you're probably not used to disappointment.
Or yeah, or not used to a bar that's this high,
Yeah.
that can be a really weird feeling if, yeah, if, and the further along you get, the, um, the tighter the competition becomes. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So from high school to undergrad, you get students who have a certain competence level to be in college, and then students who have a certain competence level to be in a master's program, and then students who have a certain competence level to be in a doctoral program, and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter as you go along.
Yeah.
Meaning, suddenly, like the straight A student who's really bright is in the mix with a bunch of other straight A students who are really bright. And so you feel less, yeah, it feels a lot less like things are easy.
Yeah. And maybe it's an uncomfortable situation for them, something that's
Yeah.
completely foreign,
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
and almost feels like maybe it shouldn't be happening, but we know that it should.
Right, right. Because it's not that you're not supposed to fail. You know what, like I don't know that I've known any, like all the people that I look up to who I see as incredibly successful have had plenty of failures and they're supposed to, it's
Mhm.
just for me too.
Yeah. What about, so for you personally, when you
Mhm.
were going through your doctoral program, specifically your dissertation,
Yeah.
because that's, the big culmination at the end, what were your biggest challenges during that stage?
Um, well, I basically did two, so that was fun.
Oh,
I
wow, you're an overachiever.
No, it was not an overachiever. It's because the first one was a miserable failure. So with
Okay.
with my first study, and when I say I did two dissertations, I mean like I had one experiment that I went through the entire process of like data collection and analysis, and then pulled out and had to start over from scratch. So basically, when I say that my advisor gave me a lot of freedom to kind of do what I want to do, he definitely did, and that he would let me try things that maybe weren't really like smart, but I wanted to try them, and he'd be like, okay, fine, collect data on that and see what happens. And basically my first study that I did just didn't produce interesting results whatsoever. So it's something that it's one of those file drawer problems studies where
Mhm.
basically there wasn't anything interesting that came out of it. It just was null data. And so that wouldn't have been an ideal dissertation. It wouldn't have been good for me to proceed with. And so I started over. So I started over with something different, that was a similar study, but the type of study that no matter which way the data went, it would produce interesting results and I would like have something to talk about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I would say in the dissertation phase, that was probably my biggest challenge, is just getting through all of that data collection and analysis, and then realizing I need to completely like backtrack and do a totally different study. Um,
So how long did it take you to get to that stage? Did you have all of your chapters written? Like, did you do your lit review and all of that and collect all the data?
I had
So
the
you
lit
wrote
review
an
totally
entire lit
done.
review, chapter 1, 2, 3, did a study, and then went to write up the results, and then had to start over again?
Yeah, basically. The good news is, the thing that didn't make it totally excruciating and awful is that the new study that I did, a lot of the lit review was overlapping. So it's not like all the research and reading that I had done to that date was useless, because I did a study within the same general topic area, just a completely redesigned study. But yeah, I basically had a lot of writing and stuff that I just had to set aside, just put it in a big, fat, monstrous binder, file it away in the file drawer, and start over.
Yeah.
So
How long did it take you, like the first study, from the time that you started it to the time that you realized it was a no-go?
I would say, and I'm guessing here because I'm just trying to go off of memory, 6 to 9 months probably.
Okay. So you lost a good half of a year to almost a year
Yeah.
doing something that didn't work. And then how long did it take you to get back on track?
Oh, well, I was back on track pretty much immediately. That's just kind of my personality though.
Yeah.
Like my recovery periods tend to be fairly brief. Like I want to like wallow in my sorrow like anybody else, you know, and like go home and like cry in my pajamas and watch Netflix and feel like the world is ending. But then I usually pick myself up really quickly. So there really wasn't much of a gap in between. I mostly just switched right on over. There was plenty of tears in my advisor's, you know, office and all that stuff. Like I won't say I didn't do lots and lots of like crying, but I restarted pretty quickly.
And then how long did it take you from the time that you restarted? So it's like we're talking 6 to 9 months of something that, you know, gets, as they say on Shark Tank, what is it? They say, take the dog out back and shoot it or whatever. So you had to do that with your baby that you've been working on for 9 months, and then you start again. And then how long did it take you to finish from there?
2 or a year and a half, maybe a year and a half. I could be off by a few months.
Okay. So like a year and a half from the time that you restarted?
Yeah, until the time that I had like degree in hand.
Okay. So this was like over 2 years, like over
Yeah.
a 2-year journey.
Yeah.
But so in theory you could have, which what happens a lot, which is that people will have something like this happen and then they have the tears and then they don't bounce back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
That's
it
why there's so many.
really derails them.
Mm-hmm.
Like
That's why
you
there's
said,
so many
how it's like there's a big failure and it's really hard for people to come back from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so really what got you through was just having your Netflix pity party, but then saying, all right, I'm getting back on the horse and going immediately. So that's
right.
essentially what got you through.
Right. Right. And, you know, and if I had, you know, worried and cried for weeks or even months on end, that would have just made the situation worse. It would have made it worse because my stress would have built even more and more, because then it wouldn't have just been, oh, I wasted 6 to 9 months. It would have been, oh, I've wasted 10. Now I've wasted 12 months. Now I've wasted 14 months. And, you know, it's like that would have made the situation substantially worse.
Yeah.
So
it was really more, again, going back to what you had said before, not that, you know, things don't happen, not that problems don't come across our path. It's really what we do when they happen, because they're going to happen.
Yep. Yes, they will happen.
So what about, you talked about your challenges. Mm-hmm. What things, when you were maybe at the beginning of the first dissertation project, or when you were restarting, what were the fears going through your head both times at any of those?
Yeah. So, and I don't know how, I've already said this before, I don't know how common this would be, but for me, the scariest thing for me was taking that study that I finished and then what came after I graduated. So and I don't know how normal this is, because I didn't notice the same fears in a lot of my friends. A lot of my friends, what they were afraid of was the actual like writing process, like collecting and analyzing the data, doing the study correctly, making sure that you didn't, you know, royally screw anything up, getting all of your ideas on paper, doing all the revisions, and ending up with that massive document. Yes. For some reason, that part, even though that's what scared most of my peers, for me personally, that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was actually what would come 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Because for me, I saw my dissertation as the beginning of like a research trajectory, and the idea of like starting that trajectory, and, you know, what studies would come after it, and would a series of 4 to 6 studies over a handful of years, would that do anything? Would it mean anything? For me, that actually was the scarier part. I tend to look like pretty far in advance. Like my stresses don't tend to come from things that are like like that I'm immediately holding on to. Like for me, I tend to perseverate about things that are like 2 years down the road or 4 years down the road. But
so it was more like, not that you were worried about the present moment, but it was, if I don't get this done and develop this skill set or do this right, what's going to happen? What am I going to be able to do after?
Yes.
After graduation, if I don't get this right now, or if I don't fix whatever issues I'm having right now, like what's going to happen when I get a job.
Right. Totally. Because I mean, you know, like as doc students, you know, you're in this bubble for a while where you don't have like a real job. And I think the longer that you don't have a real job and the longer that you stay in sort of like this academic bubble, that after part can become pretty terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Did anybody in your degree program work while they were, or was it all full-time students?
It was all full-time students. I was in an R1 institution where the research was very valued and heavily emphasized, and it would have been highly discouraged for anyone to work while they did it. Which I know isn't what?
Because of the workload?
Uh-huh. Yep. It would have been impossible to keep up and work at all during that time. So
it's pretty much go all in and get it done.
Yep.
So now that you've made it to the other side and you're a faculty member, and you're working with students, we've talked about how some of them have different qualities and they respond differently to quote unquote failures or criticisms. But what about the things that people are telling students? What's the worst advice that you hear being told to graduate students? Whether it just be students who are getting a master's degree or students who are getting a doctorate and they're preparing for either their thesis or their dissertation.
Yeah. I might have to think a little bit on the tell, but I'll say the worst thing that I see being almost like done to graduate students is when faculty treat graduate school as this series of like hoops of hell that the student has to jump through. You know what I mean? Where they almost see it as like a hazing process and treat it as though it's supposed to be excruciating. It's supposed to be terrible. You're supposed to be like, you know, down in the mud, like wanting to just die because it's so awful. Like, I hate that because, you know, to me, like graduate school is supposed to be a time when you have creative freedom and you really get to almost explore and relax in a way that you might not get to when you have like a real job. You know, like graduate school should be fostering, I don't know, a love of the discipline and like re-emphasizing like curiosity and passion for learning. And I hate it when academic advisors or teachers, you know, whether or not it's a master's program or Ph.D. program, just like almost torture their students.
Yeah.
You
like
see it
sadistic or something.
What?
Like it's sadistic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's awful. It's awful.
So what would a student do if they're in a situation like that to get back to the whole point of why they're there so that they can have that love for learning?
Identify mentors that make them feel passionate about what they're doing and excited and have a sense of, you know, hope and excitement for what they're doing both in the moment and what's ahead of them. And, you know, some people will actually switch advisors. Sometimes you don't really even need to switch advisors. You might just need to add one or two to the mix, you know, like add someone who can put your head in the right space and give you the perspective that you might personally need. And, you know, the right advisor is such an individual thing for everybody. Like for some people, one advisor might work really well. And for other people, they need someone totally different. And so I think that it's important that students look to as many mentors and advisors as they possibly can in order to get their own individual needs met so that they can have what they need in order to move forward and proceed.
So it's really a matter of finding the people that will help you be successful.
Yeah.
And being an advocate for yourself.
Exactly. Find the people who give you, hope and give you clarity and make you see that like you're more than capable of finishing it and doing it and making it right.
So finding people who will celebrate your strengths
and
let those come out.
Definitely.
So we've talked a little bit about things that you don't like about what's happening as far as how students are being treated. What about the other end, especially being someone who is working with students? Are there certain things that students do unknowingly that just drive faculty crazy?
The graduates for sure. Maybe the master, but we're mostly talking about grad students tonight.
Yeah. Because grad students are, a lot of them, in a different place than someone who is a first generation undergrad.
Yeah. Oh, things that the graduate students do that drive the faculty crazy. I don't know. For some reason, the first thing that pops back into my mind again is just like an unwillingness to deal with like corrections or criticism of any sort. But we already kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it's the first one that pops into my brain.
Yeah, that's okay. We can go with it. So it's just, being willing to be open to constructive criticism and take it in stride.
Yeah. And being willing to be, like have an honest relationship where you can talk about what's confusing, talk about what's hard, talk about what you need, talk about what you need to do going forward, and both parties, both the advisor and the student, being able to be mutually honest with each other without fear of offending one another. And that obviously is a two-way thing. It requires a graduate student who's mature enough to have those open conversations about how to make their work the best it can possibly be. And it also requires a faculty member who's willing to also hear from the graduate student when the graduate student is dissatisfied and not, take offense to it. Yeah. So the most healthy relationships are actually when, both the faculty member and the graduate student are good at that, I think.
Yeah.
Because I need my me as a faculty member too, I need my graduate students to be able to say to me, hey, like, I don't really get this. Like, you're thinking that I can do this, but I don't feel like you're quite giving me the tools I need to do this. And for me to then tweak what I'm, giving the student in order to make it happen.
So what advice would you give a student who is in a situation where they feel that their needs aren't being met? They feel that their advisor isn't necessarily getting back to them or communicating with them and supporting them?
Yeah. There's two different things there, because there's, not getting your needs met, but the person's available to you. So when the person's available to you, but you still feel like you aren't getting your needs met, or like the meetings are unproductive that you have with them, there's kind of like two primary ways I would see to proceed. One is to make sure that when you're asking for things from your advisor and asking for support and stuff, to be very explicit in what you need, and also thankful and grateful, and explicitly tell them thank you for the things that they've already given you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because professors are exhausted too, and they don't want somebody showing up at their door that's constantly like, I need more stuff, So you too have to kind of like, stroke their ego a little bit and recognize that they're busy and stressed out a lot of times too. So say, I really appreciate this. I really appreciate that. I'm also looking for this thing though, the kind of, what's the old rule? Like, say something nice to set the tone before you ask for something.
What is it? Treat others like you want to be treated, or?
Well, yeah, that too.
Like that.
That too. Exactly. So when the person's available to you, you know, and there's like a mismatch, it really probably is probably coming down to communication, where you need to really get your communication skills in order so that you know how to ask for what you need and can, you know, bring them to the table that you're wanting them to be at with you. For advisors who aren't available to you, though, that obviously won't necessarily work quite as well. That might be a situation where you need to add a mentor or advisor to the mix. Because if they're just plain absent, that there might not be a whole lot you can do about that other than get extra support.
Mm-hmm. So just get resourceful and figure out other people.
Figure out other people that you can bring in order to get your needs met if that person just literally cannot because of whatever reason.
Has there ever been anything political where, when it's a situation with a dissertation where a student is required to go through that main advisor and they can't go to other people for help without going through that first person?
Oh yeah, because sometimes you can't just, you know, look for help where you need it. You do have to go through that person. I personally didn't have those problems because I had a really good advisor for me. But I've seen other people switch advisors. I've seen other people just plain switch advisors because it wasn't working.
Mm-hmm. Does that cause drama?
Yeah. Yeah. For everybody involved, of course it does. But, you know, you don't want to quit a PhD program or quit a graduate program just because you have a crummy advisor. Like, the better strategy is to try to, if you've done everything you possibly can, is to try to find a new advisor and then forge ahead. Even if it's behind 6 months.
What if switching advisors means switching to a different topic that maybe isn't your passion? Does that end up pigeonholing people into being stuck on that topic? Or is it possible, if you have to compromise on what your dissertation topic is, that you can eventually get back around to what you wanted to be doing?
Oh yeah, I would for sure say that the better option is to compromise a bit on your topic so that you can get your degree and then pivot back to the topic that, you know, makes your heart sing or whatever.
Yeah. So I've
heard a lot of people. Go ahead.
It's not like you're throwing your life away.
Yeah.
It's just you're doing what needs to be done in order to finish it.
Yes. And I've actually heard a lot of people in academia give the advice that when you choose the lab you're working in or the advisor that you have, you should actually choose the advisor, not the topic. So what most people will do is zero in on a topic, like, you know, I want to study this one thing, and then they'll find the person that best matches that thing, as opposed to finding a person who's a good fit first, and then figuring out a topic that aligns with both your and their interests.
Yeah, that's exactly what I did for my master's degree, actually.
Oh.
Because the person that the topic that I wanted to do, the person who would supervise me was up for tenure, and she said, I can't do it. I can't support you. So I went to somebody else and said, I want to do a thesis. What topic should I do? And we worked together on it. And it was something I never would have thought of, but I got it done.
Yeah.
And it prepared me for my dissertation. So I knew what I was doing when I got there.
Yeah. But one thing that's really different in my mindset now than when I was a doc student is when I was a doc student, I had a couple topics that I was interested in, and I was very zeroed in on those topics, and they just happened to fit well within the context of my advisor and my lab and everything. But I was very much married to those topics. Like, it's all I read about, it's all I knew about, it's all I cared about. But now that I'm a little further along in my career and my learning and have started to learn about a bunch of different things, I have started to develop a passion for just learning about things in general and taking each learning experience as it is, regardless of my preconceived notions about whether or not the topic will be interesting to me. Like, I've become a lot more flexible.
So it ends up being awakening things that you didn't realize were there.
Yeah, totally. Like, looking back on it now, I think I could have done a dissertation on a million different topics and been very happy and satisfied. Whereas in that moment, I was convinced there was just one or two things I was
Mhm.
interested in, period, you know?
How about people who struggle to figure out their methodology and they think, I want to do this qualitative study and my advisor wants me to do a quantitative study and I don't know how to do stats and I don't like this model, or I mean, what would you say to people in that situation?
If it's PhD level, you're going to need to have a little bit exposure to various methodologies anyway. And so you're probably just going to have to buck up and listen to your advisor, to
Yeah.
be perfectly
So just get
honest.
it done.
Yeah, yeah. Totally. And I mean, like the point of being a graduate student, whether master's or PhD, and PhD especially, is to learn how to learn and to learn how to like tackle really difficult problems. You
Yeah.
know, when I was a doc student, my dissertation ended up using this motion analysis technology, which is really complex software that's attached to cameras that shine infrared light, and the basically like setup of it and understanding how to use the software is not easy. But my advisor basically just like plopped it down and was like, all right, here's a tool for you to use, go figure out how to use it, you know. And it was imperative to my success that I just dug in and figured it out. You know, it took a really long time. Like I remember the months and months that it took me to figure out how to use that motion analysis system. Like I can still see that tiny little booth in my head, and I can still see myself like sitting there eating like snacks after snacks because it took forever. But going through those processes where you buckle down and figure out how to do something that you never knew how to do before, are so good for your, you know, professional development.
Yeah. Or just what about just as a person
Yeah, I mean,
figuring out how
as
to
a
solve
person,
problems? Like what can
yeah,
that do for the rest of your life if you
yeah,
figure out how to do that in that moment, regardless of whatever your methodology is, whatever
right,
your discipline is, whatever your topic is, to just be able to say, I was in this really difficult situation and I figured it out.
right,
So, you know, something else, life throws something else at me. I can handle that because I did this.
right. Totally, totally. And it takes months and months and months and sometimes years on end to figure those difficult things out. But it feels so good. It feels so
Yeah.
good once you
So
do.
it's really like, it's awesome. Like, it's pretty badass to be like, I'm Dr. Meredith or I'm Dr. Karen.
Yeah,
And, but also just what, it's not just about the label, but what it took to get there, what it took to
right.
earn that.
Oh, totally,
And you,
totally.
regardless of whatever your salary is or whatever job opportunities, I mean, nobody can
Yeah.
take that away from you.
Oh, totally. And it gives you a sense of confidence, just like you said, regardless of the title, you know, all the like big mountains that you had to, you know, climb over in order to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And that memory of that the memory of that has sustained me in a lot of ways in other things that I've tried to do after that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I could do that, and so I could easily do this. I could do this, and so I can easily do this other new thing.
Yeah. It's like a feeling of resilience.
Yes. Yes. Definitely.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I just had a couple other questions before we wrap this up.
Okay.
So, one question, and we've covered this before, but I wanted to just really wrap up with this. But if you could, if you had a PhD student or somebody in any doctoral program really, or any
Mhm.
graduate program, and they're, you know, maybe they've been knocked down, they had some kind of a setback in their dissertation or their thesis,
Mhm.
and they're wondering if they're going to be able to finish, if they should go on, and they're just really in the trenches and really stuck. What would you say to them?
Oh, I guess I would say it can be emotionally exhausting, and you need to find someone who can kind of wrap their arms around you, and help you pick up the pieces when you emotionally, you know, feel like you can't handle it. But then in addition to that, you need to have someone who can help you pick up the pieces professionally. So like when things were difficult for me, I kind of relied on two different sets of people. I relied on like my mom and my then boyfriend and then fiance in order to deal with the fact that I would just feel stressed or down or worried about things. But then you also need someone who can help you professionally figure out how to forge ahead. And for me at that time, it was the fact that I had a good advisor, and it was also a couple fellow doc students who were either in the same year as me or a little bit ahead of me. And I guess the ones actually a little bit ahead of me were the most helpful. But you need to somehow find somebody that can help you figure out how to pick up the pieces so that you can move forward professionally and identify what it is that you need to do in order to take that next step, and then what it is you need to do in order to take that next step after that.
So really it's just don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Yeah, don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Doctoral student.
Yeah, because if you sit in your own head, a lot of times people, when they're just sitting in their own head ruminating on it, they're going to convince themselves to take the path of least resistance, which often is just jumping ship and doing something easier.
Mm-hmm. So don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yes, definitely.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to get more information about Dr. Meredith and her endeavors, you can visit her at www.meredithharold.com. And if you are a graduate student who is struggling to finish their thesis or dissertation and you want to get clarity on exactly what's holding you back, I'd love to help you out in a free dissertation breakthrough call. On this call, we will get you massive clarity on exactly what's holding you back and figure out what it would take to get you to the finish line. All you need to do to set up one of those meetings is go to meetme.so/Karen Dudek-Brannan. And that Dudek-Brannan is hyphenated. And you can see that website on the screen. So thank you so much for listening, and feel free to join me in the Dissertation and Thesis Writers Mastermind Facebook group, also linked up on the screen there. Take care, everybody.